There's a story I was reading the other day of a guy who repurposed an old stairwell. He turned it into some kind of tiny house with an outside door, just over 300 square feet. He's renting it for $1,900 a month. Welcome back to another pod. The topic today is unaffordability in Canada. The unaffordability crisis is sweeping the globe, but it seems to be specifically bad in Canada.
Never mind the $34 trillion of natural resource we have in our ground. Never mind how rich we are in intellectual property, in know-how, in can-do attitude, in entrepreneurialism. We should be better than this. That's what I'm trying to get at. We are better than this. And what scares me is that 47% or so of Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck. But what's even more alarming about that, as you go up the age bracket, so like between the age of 18 to 30, it's like 15%. And then you go from 35 to like 50 or 54 or something, and it's like 57%. So it's getting higher as people are getting older. I haven't looked at the seniors. I hope to God the seniors are not living CPP check to CPP check. That is scary. But what we're seeing is this. It goes back to the whole thing about the demographics. No wonder nobody's having any kids in this country. 35 to 54 years old, 57% of the country is broke and they're working their asses off.
Here's the thing. It's become unavoidable now. It's become so, the weight of it has become so big that this is a daily topic in politics, in news. Every time you open the newspaper, go online, it's something related to housing prices, rental prices, grocery costs, fuel, whatever it may be. It's entered the forefront of the Canadian psyche, and it's becoming a huge problem for the Liberal government that's been in power for 7 or 8 years. The deficit spending is debasing the currency, and it's adding a bit of fuel to the inflation. And now that they've had to raise interest rates so much to combat the inflation, they're soaring the cost of home ownership. You know, I know professionals, I know guys, you know, with smaller mortgages, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 that have doubled, that have seen their mortgage payments go from like $1,600 to $2,600, $2,700. And you know, if you're a middle class working family, you can't take a hit like that and maintain your lifestyle at all. You're cutting back massively, like trips, anything extra is completely off the table. They're having to make huge lifestyle changes, and there's going to be consequences politically, socially. You know, I jump online the other day, and it's like I feel like I'm in a time warp. Like I'm in the twilight zone. Price controls. The innovation minister summons the 5 largest grocers, Costco, Walmart, Loblaws, Metro, one of the other ones, summons them over to Ottawa, says, stabilize grocery prices or we're coming in with new taxes. So this is where we're at, right? This is how the government is trying to control inflation, right?
Price controls are being implemented. Subsidies are being implemented all over the Western world for various things, from food to electricity prices. It's not going to stop until governments start to realize the answer to solving this inflation crisis is threefold. Lower taxes. Number one, lower taxes, lower spending. Number 2, remove red tape so we can build houses rapidly. And number 3, and probably the most important if you're worried about food prices, lower energy costs. How about this? How about this?
Well, no, the CEO
bring in more competition. Bring in more competition for grocery stores. How do you do that? You lower taxes. When you have more choice as a consumer, prices drop. It becomes a race to the bottom. That's how free markets work.
How about you slash the taxes for all these smaller outfits instead of always benefiting the Amazons or the Walmarts, these massive, you know, conglomerates? Do something that's going to make the small guy competitive. Well, in a massive way, not something little, but do something massive there.
Look what they did for developers who are building rental properties. They took off the GST. That was a smart play. The Liberals enacted it. Great move. They need to cut taxes in a lot of other places and reduce spending to get us out of this inflationary disaster. And you talk about You talk about Canadians worrying about this every day. Well, no shit. They go to the grocery store. They got to buy food. It's absurd how much we're paying for food now. We talked about this almost 2 years ago. We said, if this inflation keeps up for more than a year, it's going to be a crisis for the working poor. It's already a crisis for the working poor. And now it's a crisis for the middle class. We're talking about middle class who can barely put food on the table. What happens to them investing in their future? What happens to their RSP contributions? It's out the window. So now even more of a strain is being put on the CPP program because people aren't saving. Relying on Canada Pension Plan when you retire?
Yep. All these
Crazy.
things have a compounding effect. Right?
I don't blame the Liberals for the inflation. Inflation was coming no matter who was in power. The
What,
entire
just because of
Western
supply
world.
chain?
Well,
Supply
supply chain for one, and loose monetary policy for 15 years. When you have loose monetary policy for 15 years, we wrote about this in 2010. You have loose monetary policy, cheap rates, historically low rates where money is cheap. Asset prices go up. Very basic. Demand goes up. You increase the cost to borrow money 15 years later after everybody said, oh, I'm going to buy the big house, nice car, all this crap. And you increase rates the fastest you've ever done in history, 10 times or 12 times in 18 months or whatever it is. Well, no kidding. We're going to be in a crisis. But when you have, just because you're increasing rates rapidly does not bring inflation down rapidly. That's not how it works. When you have supply chain issues. When you have high energy costs, when you have limited housing supply, and you have a rapidly growing population, like all these things come into play. And this stuff's been bubbling since 2008. It's been brewing, I should say, since 2008 with quantitative easing and loose monetary policy with low interest rate. That's what happens. And now we're dealing with it. The hangover is brutal, but there are ways to make it feel a little bit easier. There are ways to cure the headache of the hangover, at least. Might feel a little nauseous when you go to the grocery store, but the headache's gone at least.
So the strikes. Now, I talked about the cascading negative compound effect. All of these strikes, all of these unions walking out has to do with one thing, the affordability crisis. Inflation being out of control and then not able to afford things. But this creates a wage price spiral because when you have labor disruptions, you go on strike, you get a massive pay hike. Now that consumer has more money, enough money to go out and spend. It keeps demand chasing supply, keeps demand up.
Yeah, and it also increases the cost for the consumer who buys from the company that just went on strike.
It creates this loop back, right? And I see it all around. I mean, I've got a neighbor who's high up in the fire department. They just got 20% over 3 years. Look at the United Auto Workers in the US. This is the biggest strike ever from the big three, right? They're demanding a 40% wage hike through 2027 and an immediate 20% hike. What I'm trying to allude to is when you start giving people these massive, double-digit raises year after year, how are prices for anything ever going to come down? The other crisis that no one's talking about is inflation-adjusted pensions. If you have an inflation-adjusted pension, if you're a teacher or a police officer or a firefighter, you're okay. Now, a lot of companies, huge companies, UBS in Switzerland, for example, it's not inflation adjusted. Now, Switzerland doesn't have a big inflationary problem. They got 2-3% inflation. But in Canada or the US or the UK, there's millions of people who have a pension that's not adjusted for inflation. So the company has agreed to give them an X, number per year, and that's it after they retire. So if you have inflation running at even 5% for 5 years, there's a 25% cut. Boom. Canada in 2022, a total of 2 million days of time loss because of labor disputes. You want to know why our productivity goes lower and lower every year? This is one of them. Now, that's the highest number since 2009. Get this. In 2023, we're already running 25% higher than 2022 in terms of hours lost. 2023 will be probably the highest ever in Canadian history, working hours lost due to labor disputes. The power is shifting back to the worker for many reasons. The fertility crisis that we've talked about time and again, the workforce is shrinking. People
and also it's a tight labor market. The labor movement as a whole has timed these massive amounts of strikes perfectly because we're in a tight labor market in an inflationary environment. So
it's the double whammy.
They're going to get double
this
whammy.
Happened in the 70s.
They're going to get most of what they asked for.
They're going to get all of what they asked for, or most. And this happened in the 70s, and you're exactly right. People are going to the grocery store. They don't have enough. they're getting pissed off. They can read the headlines of what the banks, what these huge companies are making. They're coming together and they're going on strike.
And Buddy's stocking the shelf at the grocery store is going to be going on strike too. And it just becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that continues to drive prices up. This inflation is here to stay. This is a long-term play that I don't think is going to get solved before 2025, sadly.
The debt is starting, the interest, right? The interest payments are beginning. Like we did a few weeks ago, we wrote, Canadians are in trouble. And it looked at the amount of interest that Canadians are paying on a monthly, quarterly basis, mortgage payments, credit card payments. And it had grown from like 90 billion a quarter to 140 billion a quarter.
Yeah.
And that was old data. That was before the 5%. This is on the way up. Canadians are, going to be paying hundreds of billions of dollars in interest on a quarterly basis beginning
and
now.
Look at renters. How do they graduate into home ownership, which should be the goal for every renter and every government and every landlord? You want to provide a product that can allow people to save. It's a good product. It's a desirable product so they can be a homeowner one day. Well, rents are, I don't know about Vancouver. I know they're probably up large, but in Calgary here, they're up 40% in 2.5, 3 years. Unfortunately, people who rent typically don't have much disposable income. So think about the pressure that's putting on them.
So in August, Canada's national average rental price was $2,117. A monthly increase from July of 1.8% and a surge of 9.8% annually. Okay, that's according to rentals.ca. What they're doing now, they're trying everything. Burnaby, a suburb outside of Vancouver, a city outside of Vancouver, just approved laneway houses. Basically, any house that's got a decent lot, throw up a laneway house in the backyard.
Good.
And, Vancouver did that 14 years ago. They're legalizing, all basement suites. It goes on and on. But Montreal, there's a story I was reading the other day of a guy who repurposed an old stairwell. He turned it into some kind of tiny house with an outside door, just over 300 square feet. He's renting it for $1,900 a month.
Jeez.
When you see things like that and you hear things like that, it's like, wow, that's kind of a crazy story. But, these aren't just one-offs. This is happening. Stories like that are happening across the country. Again, when UPS drivers are making $170,000 US, right? And every single union in the country is demanding pay hikes, reduced hours, better benefits. The wage price spiral is why the central banks in the world are in panic mode, jamming interest rates up. If they don't get inflation under control soon, the wage price spiral is going to destroy our economies and ensure that inflation lasts even longer. It's a 4-part cycle. Wages rise after negotiations, successful negotiations by workers. That increases consumer spending. Now you have demand pull inflation because the higher consumer demand for goods and services puts upward pressure on prices. And then finally, as prices continue to rise, workers demand more, and it keeps going around and around like this. We are deep into this cycle right now, and the only way to break it is to stabilize inflation and prices.
Which means the key stat that to monitor, and I think what they're monitoring, is a rising unemployment rate. That is the only solution to inflation, sadly.
They are going to have to break this economy before inflation flattens out.
I wish we had a little more of an optimistic tone today, but that about wraps it up. Thanks for tuning in.
See you next time. Welcome back to another pod. I was going to say what episode it is, but we don't know.
We don't even know.
It has it.
Could be, I don't know.